Okay, let's unpack this. We are taking a deep dive today into a stack of documents, legislative bits, analyses, all focused on one specific section of a big bill in Congress, Title VI of H.R.1.
Exactly. Think of it as us pulling out the key stuff, the essentials, just for you, straight from the source material provided.
Right. Our goal today is simple. Understand the big investments and, well, the priorities outlined in this Title VI, specifically looking at border security and related homeland security things based only on these sources we have in front of us.
We're going to look at where the money's going, what kind of tech gets defined and funded, and maybe most importantly, what these sources suggest about the overall approach to the border proposed here.
So let's jump right in. Title VI. Our sources say it lays out some really substantial funding for the Committee on Homeland Security. This is for fiscal year 2025.
And a key point right away is how long this funding lasts. It's not just a one-off for the year. The sources are clear. These funds stick around until September 30, 2029.
That definitely signals a longer-term view.
For sure.
Yeah.
This isn't a quick fix they're outlining.
And the total investment figure for border security in these documents,
Right.
it's huge, around $67 billion specifically through this title.
Yeah, it's a massive number. And it's directed into specific buckets, The sources show the main investment areas in Title VI are physical, infrastructure, technology, and personnel.
Sort of a three-pronged approach, it seems.
That's how it's presented, yeah. A multi-component strategy.
Okay, so here's where the numbers get really eye-popping. The biggest single chunk by far goes to physical stuff. Barriers, infrastructure.
Absolutely. The sources detail a, staggering amount. Over $46 billion. That's specifically for building, installing, or upgrading barriers, primary, waterborne, secondary, plus the access roads needed.
And that $46 billion, it isn't just the walls themselves, right? It covers those barrier system attributes, too.
Exactly. Things like cameras, lights, sensors, technology that's integrated with the barrier. It's part of that physical package.
Okay. And then there's more for buildings.
Yep, another $5 billion specifically for U.S. Customs and Border Protection CBP facilities and checkpoints near the borders.
So if you add the barriers and the facilities together, the sources show we're talking over $51 billion just for physical infrastructure.
Well, it's the vast majority of the funding discussed here. And what the sources suggest this points to is a really fundamental long-term strategy focused on controlling the border with physical obstructions.
Like reinforcing and expanding the physical border itself.
Right, potentially changing the landscape for decades.
Yeah.
And in this picture, technology is framed as something that supports or enhances those physical barriers.
There's even a really specific, smaller item in there, $50 million to remove invasive plants, like carrizo cane along the Rio Grande.
Yeah, the sources mention that. Because, they state, these plants impeded border security operations.
So even environmental management gets folded into supporting the barrier and patrol effectiveness.
It shows how comprehensive this physical-first approach seems to be based on the funding details.
Okay, so shifting from the physical walls and roads, technology also gets a significant slice, though much smaller than infrastructure. Section 6003 talks about tech funding over $6.2 billion.
That's right. And key investments mentioned in the sources include just over $1 billion for non-intrusive inspection equipment.
NII, that's like scanners for vehicles and cargo.
Exactly. Using AI, machine learning, primarily aimed, the sources say, at catching illicit narcotics, enhancing detection without having to physically search everything.
Okay. What else on the tech front?
Almost $2.8 billion for upgrading and buying border surveillance tech, generally cameras, sensors, that sort of thing.
And biometrics.
Yep, about $673 million for the biometric entry-exit system. That covers deploying the tech and related costs. The stated goal is tracking who comes in and who leaves using biometric data.
Now, did the sources mention any concerns or oversight for that biometric system? It sounds like a lot of data collection.
That's a key point. The sources we have don't mention any ethical concerns or specific oversight mechanisms tied to this biometric funding. It's just not discussed in the material here.
Interesting silence. Okay, what other tech funding?
Over $1.2 billion for air and marine operations platforms, planes, boats, maybe drones for rapid response.
Makes sense.
And about $16 million for the National Vetting Center. That's for supporting screening, vetting, expanding criminal history databases on foreign nationals. So investing in more sophisticated data crunching.
Right, more data analysis capacity.
And another $500 million specifically tagged for other efforts against trafficking, including fentanyl.
Now, the sources mention a specific definition for autonomous tech.
They do, in Section 6003.
Yeah.
It's defined as integrated software and hardware using sensors, computers on board, and AI to spot things that CBP personnel would otherwise have to identify manually, basically automating detection.
And there's a restriction tied to that.
Yes, a specific one. None of that nearly $2.8 billion for general border surveillance tech can go towards autonomous surveillance towers unless they've been tested and formally accepted by the federal government as being able to deliver those autonomous capabilities.
So, a check on deploying untested autonomous systems.
It seems like it. The sources suggest this points to some caution about unproven tech, recognizing autonomous systems are different and really emphasizing federal validation before rolling them out with these funds.
So, overall, the tech piece, how do the sources frame its role?
It's consistently presented as augmenting the physical barriers and the human patrols, enhancing detection, ID, tracking, response, supporting that main physical structure. Significant funding, yes, but definitely secondary to the infrastructure spending.
Got it. Okay, so beyond the physical barriers and the tech, what about people, personnel, and support systems?
Also a substantial investment there, over $6.1 billion total across different initiatives mentioned in these sources.
And the biggest part of that?
Over $4 billion is set aside just to hire and train more people. We're talking additional Border Patrol agents, Office of Field Operations officers, air and marine agents, and support staff too.
And specific money for training centers.
Yes, about $285 million for training at FLETC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and another $465 million just for improving FLETC facilities. The sources note FLETC is seen as really key for shaping the agency culture, especially with this kind of expansion.
And they're trying to keep the people they hire, too.
It seems so. There's over $2 billion allocated for annual retention bonuses or signing bonuses. That's specifically for eligible operational agents and officers, Border Patrol, OFO, Air, and Marine.
So direct financial incentives.
Exactly. The sources see it that way, signaling how much value the legislation places on these specific frontline enforcement roles.
And more patrol vehicles, too.
Yep, over $800 million for additional marked patrol units.
And money just for recruitment itself.
Right, around $600 million for recruitment initiatives. Marketing, sourcing applicants, vetting them. The sources frame this as a proactive strategy, trying to shape the future workforce right from the start.
So with all this focus on hiring, training, bonuses for agents, what do the sources suggest about the kind of workforce culture this bill is aiming for?
Well, based on this heavy investment in hiring, training, and incentivizing enforcement officers, the sources strongly suggest it reinforces an enforcement-first culture within CBP. The scale of it, the targeted bonuses, it's framed as solidifying that specific operational focus.
Okay, now here's something really specific the sources highlight. A restriction on how some of that personnel money can't be used.
Yes, there's an explicit rule. None of that over $4 billion for hiring and training can be used for the duties of processing coordinators.
And what do processing coordinators do, according to the sources?
The sources explain they handle the administrative tasks for processing people who are encountered. That includes migrants, asylum seekers,
Sure.
the paperwork side of things, essentially.
So restricting funding for those roles, what's the interpretation?
According to the sources, this restriction suggests a legislative choice to prioritize away from roles directly involved in that kind of processing. It implies, based on this text, that humanitarian adjacent processing needs are being deprioritized compared to the heavily funded enforcement and interdiction roles.
Okay. Now, Title VI isn't just about the border itself, right? It funds grant programs, too.
That's right. It brings state and local law enforcement into the picture. The Operation Stone Garden Grant Program gets $450 million available through 2029, specifically to help state and local police with border security operations.
So direct funding for local help on federal border tasks.
Exactly. The sources describe it as a mechanism to integrate them into the federal strategy.
And the State Homeland Security Grant Program. Funds for specific things there, too.
Yes, run by FEMA. The sources mentioned $500 million going through this program for state and local capabilities to counter drone threats, UAS threats, detecting, identifying, tracking them.
Addressing that emerging concern.
Seems like it. And then there are really big amounts for securing major upcoming events in the U.S.
Right, I saw that. $625 million for the 2026 FIFA World Cup.
And a full $1 billion for the 2028 Olympics in L.A.
Wow. That's serious money.
It is. And again, it's channeled through that State Homeland Security Grant Program, available until 2029. The sources indicate this shows securing these high-profile international events is definitely a critical federal priority, placed right alongside border control within this Homeland Security funding title, supporting state and local efforts for those events.
And briefly, there was also money for protecting presidential residences.
Yes. Section 6004 allocates $300 million for extraordinary local law enforcement costs related to protecting places the Secret Service designates. Another piece of the Homeland Security funding puzzle in this title.
It certainly covers a wide range of things under that Homeland Security umbrella.
It does.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together. Thinking about the balance of priorities, based only on what's in these source documents. How do they seem to weigh security and enforcement versus, say, humanitarian concerns?
Looking strictly at the funding breakdown in these sources, the hierarchy is really stark. The overwhelming focus is physical infrastructure. The $46.5 billion for barriers alone dwarfs everything else.
Way more than the $6.2 billion for tech or the $4.1 billion for direct hiring and training.
Exactly. So the sources describe the strategy as layered, yes, but fundamentally built on massive physical fortification. Technology supports that, and a large enforcement-focused workforce underpins it.
And the sources connect this approach to militarization.
They explicitly use that concept, yes, aligning the focus on interdiction, control, deterrence through physical means, tech, surveillance, and expanded enforcement personnel with the idea of militarizing the border.
Now, here's a critical point we need to stress, based purely on our sources. What do they say about reconciling the security focus with humanitarian needs?
This is key. The sources explicitly state they contain no information on that reconciliation. Zero discussion in these documents about processing asylum claims, providing humanitarian aid, ensuring safe passage, or any other humanitarian aspects you might expect.
It's just absent from this material.
Completely absent. The only related point, as we discussed, is that restriction on funding processing coordinators.
Right, which the sources interpret how?
As suggesting a deprioritization of those roles involved in processing individuals, further underlining the emphasis on enforcement over humanitarian processing, at least as presented in these specific texts.
Okay. One last small item the sources mention. $1 million for commemorations.
Yes, $1 million, available until 2029 for commemorating efforts and events related to border security.
And symbolically, what does that suggest, given the rest of the funding?
Well, in the context of billions focused almost entirely on enforcement and barriers, and the noted silence on humanitarian aspects in these sources, this small commemoration fund kind of symbolically underscores where the legislative priority lies. It validates the security mission, likely honors the enforcement personnel.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, what's the big picture from these sources? Based only on this material, Title VI of H.R.1 seems to lay out a very comprehensive, very long-term plan for border security.
One that's heavily centered on physical barriers and expanding an enforcement workforce. Technology plays a big role, but clearly a supporting one.
And the explicit lack of info in these sources about humanitarian concerns, plus that specific restriction on processing coordinator funding, it paints a picture of priorities, doesn't it?
It certainly highlights a very clear priority structure as presented in this material. You get a detailed view of the legislative approach just by following the money, as described here.
Which leaves us with a question to think about. Given this huge investment in physical barriers and enforcement, and these specific silences in the sources we looked at, what might that suggest to you, the listener, about this bill's overall vision for handling the very complex realities of the border? Something to definitely mull over.